the Connect. Connect means context on extremism in the MENA and Balkan societies, an Horizon project. The second speaker will be Moussa, Mar Benseny, who is the program director of NOVACT, the International Institute on Nonviolent Action, and she's also expert in international cooperation, peace building, human rights, advocacy, and non-violence in the Mediterranean region. And thirdly, Moussa Bourekba will be with us, researcher in CIDOB, the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, and associate professor also in international relations at the Ramon Llull University in Barcelona, very close to the center of Barcelona. Thank you for all to be here and to participate in these debates. And also thanks for the attendees, not only master students, but also others that are listening us. You will have, for the attendees now, you will have an opportunity to use the Q and answer model for panel, for question. I will try to run myself the question and the question and answer. But do not hesitate to give already some inputs related to different arguments, clarification on whatever, because my purpose, and this is how I also speak with speakers, is to do some kind of a much more interactive debate. Then nothing more from my side. I just coordinate and maybe also some question at the end also, and I give the floor directly to Lurdes.
Okay, thank you very much, Ricard. Thank you to all the students and all the participants that attended the session. I would like to apologize for not having my camera on. We have a small technical issue. There are always technical genes that boycott our efforts, so we will just keep cool and keep on as planned, okay? I would like also to thank Moussa and Mar for accepting to share this conversation with me and with Ricard and the students. When Ricard suggested the idea to come to the university to explain, to reflect on the research project, to share some of our premises, some of our hypotheses, some of our methodologies with them, I thought that the best persons that I could choose to be here with me would be Moussa, and could be not Mar exactly, because I don't know personally Mar, but I thought about NOVACT as being one of the main actors in dealing with these issues. Why? Because I think that the three of us in a certain way are on the same page regarding this issue, and this is very good because this allows to move the conversation forward. When dealing with radicalization and violent extremism, there are certain issues that come over again and again, and we seem to be stuck in certain issues that we have really huge difficulties to overcome. The conceptual approach issue, how we conceptually approach radicalization, what do we mean by radicalization, what means being radical, what is violent extremism, what is jihadism, what is ultra-right extremism, what is terrorism. All these conceptual ideas still remain as a trap in the field of studies. And we have been discussing about that, particularly with Moussa long time ago. Also, regarding prevention, which is one of the issues that I think concern the three of us more, which is preventing from a different approach that has been taken or assumed until now. We want to generate, and I think this is going to be at the beginning probably, a different conversation on prevention, a conversation that detaches prevention from a highly securitized approach. And I think that in this way we are all very similar in the approach of how we think and we consider prevention. So that is why Moussa and Mar are here, and I'm sure that we will learn from each other. I'm sure I will learn from them a lot. On Connect is a research and Little Action Project. It is funded by the European Union Age 2020 project. It means that this is a research that is going to be conducted for 3.5 years. And we are 14 partners involved, both partners from the European Union, but also from the Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans. This project is constructed, is built to respond to a call from the European Union. Okay, and the call was devoted to analyze and study the drivers of radicalization and violent extremism in the Middle East, North Africa, and in the Balkans. And this is the challenge, and this is where probably we will be today also fluctuating a little bit. We are going to come and go across Europe and across the Mediterranean and into the Balkans, probably, because at the end of the day, we cannot detach exactly what is going on in the Middle East, North Africa, in the Balkans, and what is going on in Europe. For example, I don't know if your students could intervene, but I think it could be very, very interesting to know. Do you know where the attacker in the Notre Dame church in Nice, where did he come from? I mean, was he a homegrown terrorist, as we call this so-called European-born terrorist? Was he from somewhere else? Yeah, I don't know if someone has the capacity to intervene or not. It could be great to have some feedback. But in any case, my argument is that both the attacker from Nice and the attacker in Vienna, one came recently from Tunisia, the other one was Austrian born, but with an Albanian North Macedonian identity. Okay, so both of these countries are countries that we are going to research in our research project in Connect, meaning that we cannot detach what's going on around the European Union from what is happening also in the European Union. But radicalization, violent extremism has been a field that has been studied mainly from a Western-centric, Eurocentric, Western-centric approach. I mean, all of us, and I include myself in here, first of all my impressions, all my reflections, all my analysis come from the experience of radicalization and violent extremism in Europe, or even in Spain, or even in Catalonia. Okay, and we know very little. There is little literature, there is little done, there is little knowledge on what's going on, what is the state of the art in the neighboring regions of the European Union, although it is obvious that it is very important that what happens then there will have an impact also in Europe. So the idea was trying to detach this hyper-securitized approach to radicalization and violent extremism, okay, this overemphasis that has been granted to radicalization, this overemphasis to religion, on religion. I mean, radicalization, violent extremism has given, all the research has been given a very prominent role to religion. And these last times, certainly economic issues, marginalization, certain socioeconomic factors. Also, with the emergence of ISIS in these last years, social media and the capacity of recruitment through social media, and the idea that narratives could be the solution, creating counter narratives could be the solution to the problem of radicalization. This has marked the agenda in Europe, but also in these regions, in the Middle East, North Africa, and in the Balkans. I mean, in fact, in these regions, what the little things that have been done have mainly been done with external foreign funding and following an agenda of the foreign donors. So not responding to the real needs, to the real demands, or to the real concerns of the grassroots society, but responding to the interests, to the concerns and the worries of the external donors. Also, radicalization has mainly everywhere been approached from a state-centric approach. It's the state, it's a matter of a state, it's a high matter of a state, it's defense, it's security. So it has always been as a state issue. And giving a very small role to civil society. And when civil society has started to be engaged, it has started to engage in a somehow perverted role. Instead of acting as civil society, we have securitized civil society in order to respond to the emergency. The idea of countering violent extremism is let's try to avoid the violent act from happening. And prevention was considered as this, as avoiding the violent act from happening. While I know that with Moussa, we have been always, for a long time, saying that prevention needs to be an earlier stage, in a different earlier stage. It has to be considered as a social action, and it has to be desecuritized. So in this context, and also focusing, because in Connect we focus on young people from 12 to 30, focusing even with very small young teenagers, the idea is starting to conceive, to analyze the drivers of violent extremism, trying to test those drivers that are already given for granted, those drivers that are accepted by everybody, be it religion or socioeconomic deprivation, marginalization, all these drivers that are commonly accepted, test new drivers, like, for example, leisure opportunities. To what extent leisure opportunities and the lack of leisure opportunities, not only cultural, educational, but leisure opportunities might become a driver per se. How COVID will impact in all the already known and analyzed drivers, how they interact between different levels of analysis. Let's analyze these drivers from the state and how the state frames citizens. I am, okay, sorry. No, sorry, just sorry for the interruption. I was trying to connect my camera, but it seems it's not working. So the idea is trying to analyze these 7 drivers that we have identified later on. I am sure that you have had a look at the website, so you already know the 7 drivers. And it's testing them and seeing how they interrelate with each other in order to create context. Say it enabling, say it vulnerable, say it conducive context that could explain why radicalization takes place among certain people and why it does not take place among certain other people. The idea is try to detach also from this tradition of profiling and profiling people in order to avoid the violent act. The idea is understanding the drivers in order to map them, in order to understand the relations from these different levels, macro, the state, meso, the community, and micro, the individual, mix them all, see how they interrelate, and then come back to this community level, to this intermediate meso level, and start analyzing and researching on prevention. And this will be the last phase of the research project, in which we will build prevention strategies together with the research done on the community, at the community level, addressed to civil society actors and local authorities, okay, and with a very strong participation in the process of youth, young people, and particularly women. That could be more or less the idea. The idea is that at the end we have some good, valuable information on how the drivers of radicalization interplay and how prevention can be better designed in order to be a long-term but rewarding effect. The idea is that if prevention works, nothing happens. And that's what we want, that nothing happens. I will leave it here. And I think that the debate can be much more interesting.
Thank you, Lourdes, for this wonderful framing, I will say, of the debate. I have myself several questions, but I cannot avoid now to refrain and to leave the floor to Mar for the first framing also. Mar, it's your turn. Thank you, Lourdes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And as well, sorry for the camera, but I will try to share my screen. So
yeah, you are able to do that, yeah.
Yeah.
Some color at least.
So you won't miss to see my face. And well, first of all, thank you to all of you for the invitation. Thank you to the students, to the participants in this debate. As Ricard said, my name is Benseny, and I work at the NOVACT, International Institute for Nonviolent Action. And I'm here to represent NOVACT, but especially the Observatory to Prevent Extremist Violence. that is a platform of civil society organizations that we launched along with other more than 100 organizations last January 2017. And the idea, as Lourdes said, of this observatory was to put ourselves as civil society as an actor to plan, to participate in PV debates and strategies. And in fact, we presented in 2017 the regional plan of action of the Euro-Mediterranean Civil Society. That in fact helps us as a methodology to work regionally, nationally, and local level through these three pillars, let's say. First of all, trying to understand, as Lourdes said, the drivers, the factors, the different contexts and actors around violent extremism. Also defining public policies where civil society is at the center. And in fact, we have been working on civil society plans of action to prevent violent extremism. And we have already almost the final results in Iraqi Kurdistan, Iraq, Jordan, and Tunisia. And we are advocating for the stronger role in the national governmental plans of action. And for sure, responding through mainly community resilience. Yeah, as Lourdes said, I think that we will be all really agree on the basics, even if in the worldwide there is a lot of different opinions regarding PV. But I would like to highlight our approach that is based from a human rights approach, that we consider the different types, forms of violence, the direct, the structural, and the cultural, that we consider different perpetrators. Also, this is it's important to highlight it, not only individuals or groups, but also corporations or states can perpetrate acts of violent extremism. And again, we agree for sure with Lourdes, Moussa, but I think it's important to highlight that we consider all kinds of violent extremism, not only the concept I think that we agreed to use was violent Salafist jihadism, but also far-right violence, Islamophobia, authoritarianism, etc., etc. So about the drivers, to learn a bit of, I will work from our, as I said, from our experience from the ground with our organizations that we are launching these plans of action from the civil society. I would like to highlight these four drivers at macro level. The socioeconomic injustice and unequal access, with two examples. For example, the Tunisian case where there is an organized marginalization and planned exclusion, not only in Tunisia, but where you can see a country with the coast, the north of the country, more developed than the rest of the country. So youth feel unequal access to job, education, leisure, as Lourdes said, for sure. And that also has a link with even the identity, where some studies show that there is an increasing identity of a regional, local level more than a national one. And the example of Jordan is the management, for example, of the refugee crisis. Jordan is already a country with most of the population comes from other parts of the Middle East, and the last Syrian crisis really put the country at the limit at some point. Political repression and human rights violations for us, especially from NOVACT, is really important to highlight it. Research from the Institut Tunisien d'études statistiques, the Statistic Institute of Tunisia, showed that the 90% of foreign fighters from Tunisia felt repressed by their government. And there are a lot of studies in other countries that show the same. Another one would be the low confidence in political participation. The same study in Tunisia, and this was really interesting for us to look at it, showed that more than a half of the foreign fighters from Tunisia participated at the 2011 revolution. That means they don't. There is a lot of frustration. There is not this youth feel that there is no opportunity to participate politically in their countries. In fact, last November there were parliamentary elections in Jordan. Yes, COVID context, but their participation was at 30% of the population with right to vote. And the last one it would be the perceived collective grievances. That for sure it's difficult to put it on the frame, but for us we cannot detach for sure social perceptions and expectations from these drivers. At less and micro level, I would like to focus on the religion as Lourdes already pointed out. The studies we were reading, we were working on for our context analysis, showed that foreign fighters in both Jordan and Tunisia were not especially religious people before. So for us, for sure, the use of religion might play a role, but reality, as Lourdes explained with these examples of Vienna and Nice, is much more complex than dividing the world into religious blocks, let's say. Though it's true that mosques appeared as an important place of recruitment. And that I wanted to connect it with the digital context, because from our experience, for sure we have to work on alternative narratives at our social media level, but to know also that which spaces are for what or which purpose they do have. And here I finally, really briefly, talking about the common strategies. No? So what we can do. In fact, from the UPF, one of our strengths, I would say, is that we try to look for best practices and to share which initiatives may have worked in specific contexts and can be applied in other ones. And one of these would be the alternative narrative through social media resilience. And indeed, here is, we are this week finalizing this campaign through Facebook. Is Facebook that the organizations participants are youth organizations in Iraq, Kurdistan, and Jordan. And in fact, had been designed directly by youth organizations, by youth activists. The first one about, it's talking about how COVID has increased the rumors, how we can try to check things in order to detect fake news, how cyberbullying it is a thing, and how even Islamophobia is an issue, and there is the debate even in the Middle East. Another alternative narrative tool that that for us works really a lot from the ground, it's sports and arts against violence. And this is photo is from a theater piece that it was played in Tunisia last year with 2,000 participants. And here you have a bit of ideas about activities of sports against violence. There is the Marathon of Erbil and heritage, that it's not that known. And I think it's something that we have learned from our partners in Iraq or Lebanon, that they have used the heritage, try to work with youth through the love from the common river, the common heritage, in order to work for the social cohesion, let's say. Finally, and linked to the one of the titles that I mentioned before, the human rights respect and protection. We do analyze as well with different partners the impacts of anti-terrorist policies, and we, as well as human rights violations, and we protect human rights defenders. And indeed, it's not it's something not only in these countries of the MENA or Balkans, also in our countries of Northern, let's say, Europe, how states use anti-terrorist policies to limit civil society space, to limit dissident groups, let's say. And this is something strong that we try to focus on. And linked on the political participation also that I was mentioning before, we try to strengthen as well the youth participation, especially, and this is NOVACT, it's an International Institute of Nonviolent, the non-violent activists, the youth activists, as an actor, as well as different PV activities in schools, resource centers, or youth centers. And yeah, I would leave it as well here. Thank you very much. You have the mic.
Your
off?
mic.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that thank you for this wonderful framing also. And before properly beginning the debate, I leave the floor to Moussa, and then we can begin after that. Moussa, it's your turn.
Yes, thank you very much, Ricard, for giving me the floor, and I would like to thank GRITIM and also IEMed for this invitation. So, like my colleagues, I would like to share here a couple of reflections, or maybe some ideas for debate, based on two of my areas of research. So one is researching Arab youth in the framework of a project that was an ancestor of what we call Horizon 2020, the FP7's project called Sahwa. On the other hand, my more recent research on the process of radicalization. I think for those who are listening to us, there is one problem which was stressed by Lourdes Vidal during the first intervention, and it's a big problem that I think we should actually recognize and be aware of. It's the lack of data when it comes to study or to discuss the drivers of radicalization. So we do have anecdotal evidence for certain drivers of violent extremism, but it's impossible to come up with a universal a set of universal explanation for what works and what doesn't. And this is due to the nature itself of radicalization. It's a process that is individual and context specific. So a driver of radicalization in Ripoll may not work in the case of Ceuta and Melilla, or in the case of Tunisia, which is also different from Morocco. So despite of this lack of data, there is one thing that we have seen, I would say almost at a global level, which is the increasing share of youngsters in the rank of violent extremist groups in the past years. And in that sense, I mean, I think that all of you are aware that an organization such as the Islamic State had, of course, played a role in what some people have called a democratization of jihadism. So let me just give you a few figures so that you can see how overrepresented are youngsters. In 2017, there was a study published for the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism on the profile of foreign fighters who traveled to Syria and Iraq to join terrorist groups between 2012 and 2016. So when I talk about foreign fighters, we are talking about over 40,000 people from over 120 countries who went to Syria and Iraq. So this is something huge. Regarding the typical profile, this report was indicated that the typical profile of foreign fighter was somebody who was most likely to be male, young, and disadvantaged economically, educationally, and in terms of the labor market. He's also, and I'm still quoting the report, he's also more likely to come from a marginalized background, both socially and politically. Most were unemployed or underemployed, and or said that their life lacked meaning. So I think this gives an idea, an overview of the so-called drivers of violent extremism. In the case of Europe, most of the jihadists who perpetrated terrorist attacks in our territory in the past 2 decades, they were aged between 18 and 30. And during the time that ISIS was gaining momentum in 2016, actually the fastest growing age group amongst radicalized individuals in Europe was between 12 and 17-year-old. So this gives you a bit an overview of how present are youngsters. And this explains why, to a certain extent, in the past 6 years, international organizations such as the United Nations, several governments, but also research, and here we are dealing with a major Horizon 2020 project, Connect, have focused on youth radicalization. So what we have seen in the past years was many scholars from different fields, actually, ranging from political science, anthropology, but also psychology, trying to explain what was going on. And in the case of Europe, these explanations of what accounts for youth radicalization, they often revolve around economic, social, and psychological factors. So some scholars have linked youth radicalization to the lack of prospects in society. Rick Coulset, a major researcher from Belgium, considers that jihadism has become a no-future youth subculture, meaning that it has become a possible way out for those who consider they have no future in society. Olivier Roy, in the same line, when looking at radicalization in France, he underlines something very interesting. Radicalization does not happen neither with the first generation of immigrants, nor with the third generation of immigrants, but it always and almost systematically happens with the second generation. That is to say, those who were born or raised in France and who rebel against a society that has not brought its promises of equality and dignity. And finally, in the field of psychology, some scholars such as Dawson, they mention the search for meaning in life to compensate for injustice or a strong orientation towards action, adventure, and risk. So by contrast, when you look at the MENA region, we often have the socioeconomic explanations for the drivers of radicalization. And actually, we start having evidence that youth radicalization has to do with interconnected processes of social, economic, and political exclusion. So these processes, they often result in a delayed transition into adulthood. And here I would like to hold on for a second, because unlike Europe and other regions in the world, in the MENA region, being young is not only a biological stage, somewhere between childhood and adulthood, but rather a condition. In general, to become an adult, you often need in this region to get married. But to get married, you need to be economically independent. And when you look at the data at the macro level, you see that in the region, we have the world's highest youth unemployment rates, between 25 and even 60% in the case of Gaza, for instance. So this is one problem, but we have another one which is much more concerning, that has to do with the pattern of unemployment in that region. Because in the MENA region, the more you are educated, the higher your chances of being unemployed. And you have, I mean, I'm saying the things rightly, you have heard that. The more you study, the less job opportunities. And this has to do with a mismatch between the education system and the labor market. We have countries that create doctors and engineers who actually do not find such opportunities in the labor market. So such a situation, and this is something that we find in many reports trying to look at radicalization in North Africa, for instance, this situation feeds what we call the feeling of relative deprivation. Relative deprivation being understood as the gap between expectations and reality. I study to become an engineer and I end up selling DVDs in the informal market. I mean, this would be a sense of relative deprivation. And such a gap actually is being very much exploited by violent extremist groups. And in that sense, I really recommend you to read a fascinating book called The Engineers of Jihad by Diego Gambetta and Stephen Hardog, that shows that engineers in the MENA region were overrepresented in the ranks of jihadist organizations. And this was due to their career outcome expectations. So what they imagined would happen has not happened in the end. So to me, it is key to look at two aspects of that problem. And here I enjoy the fact that our moderator, Professor Ricard Zapata, is from the field of migration. And in my case, I like to look at violent extremism also as a sort of migration process, either mentally or physically, meaning that you should not look only at the drivers of radicalization or think of it in terms of the demand, but you also have to look at the offer. And somebody could say you have to look at the push factors and the pull factors. What are the grievances youngsters suffer from, and what are their needs? And regarding, and I think such a perspective is very important because it means it has some implications. It means that youngsters do not join violent extremist groups just to commit violent acts. We have evidence that some have joined groups because they were promised a job, because they were promised to become adults, to have a wife, to have a status in society. So youngsters seem to be overrepresented because they are more affected by some grievances than the elders. And I think this is fundamental to understand because violent extremists take advantage of these grievances because they pose themselves as empowering agents. They are successful in promising and even in some cases providing youngsters with personal rewards. You can come and defend the cause. It can be the caliphate or something else. Material rewards, an employment, a job, and even psychological rewards. With us, you become a hero. You have a status, and so on and so forth. And I think that this part is quite missing in research, actually. We don't study sufficiently the propaganda of violent extremist groups because we often think that the only thing they promise to their recruits is, and this is absolutely wrong, they offer you a status, a job, and so on and so forth. So, and I'm concluding here, this has, in my view, 3 implications. So the first one, further research is needed on youth drivers of radicalization. And to do that research on youth drivers, I definitely believe that we need actually to engage with youngsters to better understand their grievances and to see from where they speak, from which kind of views, perceptions, but also objective conditions. Secondly, youngsters can actually help us to understand why violent extremism is an attractive option to some of them. In other words, I think the key consists in trying to understand why some youngsters radicalize, why others who share the same situation, who share the same grievances, do not. And finally, this is a reflection also on the basis of my research regarding youngsters and their efforts in prevention. What we see is that youngsters are almost always at the receiving end of PVE strategies. They are the beneficiaries or the target of policies that aim at preventing violent extremism. And I do believe that they should be included also in the design, but also in the implementation of efforts that are aimed at stemming radicalization. And with that, I conclude. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Moussa, for this intervention. Also, I think the 3 interventions complete each other. I think are completely complementary. And maybe I leave the floor to the people, but before properly beginning to see if there are some students that are asking or attendees that want to ask something, maybe I will intervene myself. The first thing is about what you have said at the beginning. Maybe Lurdes refers to that more properly, but it is not only about the drivers of radicalism or extremism and so, but the narratives that there are around that. And because we can share the idea that narrative also shape behaviors, shape perceptions, and the way that all society is speaking about that, and how they are making links that maybe are problematic because they could have some effect in other areas of society, in discrimination and so on. I am speaking about the way that all society are building the narrative of extremism related to immigration in the first way, but also putting aside other kind of extremism that come from all society also, the nationalness or this kind of extremism that is maybe not related to religion but to national believing on a homogeneity of the society and the threat of diversity in general, or the fact that diversity erodes this kind of imaginary or that all society are homogeneous and so on. And I would like to, if you are dealing with these frameworks also, because for me this framework is also drivers, because this narrative is not only inducing discrimination, but are also influence this kind of people that are much more sensible to that and feel that they are excluded because the society says that they are bad in one way or another. And then from this point of view, I think the narratives of extremism for me is very important. I have other issue related to that is maybe I have been surprised myself because maybe I am sensible to that, but how far the European Union is promoting research in many countries, and then for me this is the scope of this research project, if I understood properly, Lourdes. But I wonder myself how far European Union is trying to externalize a problem. European Union like to externalize and to put outside the territory of Europe the main problem of Europe. And then I think here there is a big problem on that, because as Lourdes says, most of the young people that have this kind of reactions are Europeans. We cannot say that they are not Europeans. And then from this point of view, I think this is a European problem, and how even through projects, Europe try to externalize. And then my recommendation to Lourdes is try to put some arguments about that, even if it is against the philosophy of this project. But I think it is very important that Europe recognize that this is a European problem. This is not something that comes from abroad. This is another question that I think I would like to pose. Another one, the third and last one. I have others, but just not. I like the Moussa that he speaks about the psychology. Psychology for me is the cognitive dimension of that is very important, because it is not only inequality, it is frustration. Frustration is an emotional issue for young people. And when young people are frustrated against the society, then they could be much more sensible to determine narrative of extremism and so on. And then this kind of frustration, I think, is very important from this point of view. And for the profile of, I see that you are focusing, most of yours are focusing on the young people. This is the title of the debate, and I think it is also the focus of the project. But what about the inductors? I think the profile not of young people that make the actions, but those that influence these young people that are here around us also. And then this kind of the profile of inductors, I am sure are not the same that the profile of the young people. They are well prepared, they are educated, they know how to manipulate minds, how to manipulate people, and prevention for me is also a must focus on these people also, and not only on the young people, inequality, frustration, and all the main variables, the macro, meso, and micro variables that show us. I think from this point of view, prevention must focus also on those that induce terrorism, And I will include within the induction maybe also some narrative of the European Union that has psychologically has many difficulties to recognize that this is not a problem that comes from outside, but this is our problem. In any case, this is my first reaction. I would like to know your reaction also. Maybe we can begin not necessarily with the same order. If you want to react, Mar, Moussa, Lurdes.
When you want, Ricard, you have, I mean, with all of you have said so many things that I have just my table full of post-its with different ideas noted. Okay. On the narratives, I think that we need to study narratives in different levels. One is, what is the narrative created on or dominant narrative on the idea of radicalization and violent extremism? And this is where you really nail the thing, is what have we transmitted, or how our public opinion understands radicalization and violent extremism? Does it immediately come to people's mind a certain profile of person? There has been a growing stigmatization of certain populations with this idea of radicalization. Even, for example, I'm not talking, for example, only about Muslims, but, for example, on this growing focus of psychological drivers behind violent extremism, there is a certain stigma set on mental illnesses that is even accrued by this narrative of psychological problems and violent extremism. So there's plenty of levels of stigmatization in these narratives. The other thing that we are trying to analyze in our project is how the narratives frame different actors. I mean, how the state frames citizens through its security policies, through its counter-violent extremist policies, how the state or even international actors frame not only individuals but also communities, and how these communities and these individuals frame themselves and frame the action of their governments. So in a certain way, we need to analyze in both directions, top-down approach and a bottom-up approach, so that we see the different interrelation. And this is impossible to detach it from the idea of perceptions and expectations. Moussa raised that issue. You also raised it, Ricard, and I think Ma also raised it at one point. Is, yeah, one thing is what we perceive we are entitled to receive, what we expect, and what we get. Okay, and this reminds me also to the idea of the feeling of relative deprivation that Moussa also mentioned. And this makes me think very clearly in the case of the Ripoll guys, okay? Once the Barcelona and Cambrils attacks occurred, everybody was saying, I don't understand why this happened. These guys worked quietly well. I mean, they were employed. They had a good job. One was a welder, the other was a plumber. I mean, they had good jobs. I mean, but has anyone considered the idea that maybe this was not their expectation from life? And this is the idea, the perception and the expectation. And this is something very difficult to grasp also with data. Okay. On the idea of that also Moussa raised on age. This is why we have done the suicidal thing or mission of working with 12 years old. Because this has become a nightmare concerning ethical issues on research. Okay, it has nothing to do when you are researching on young people to 18 above, or you are researching on young people, and particularly with such an early age, it's very difficult to carry out research. But we have managed, I mean, we have been struggling to include that because it is obviously a fact that the recruitment age is decreasing enormously. I mean, if we see, Moussa gave the data, we saw it also in Barcelona and Cambrils, how young those guys were, but we have also been seeing how recruitment in Syria among violent extremist groups now has raised the recruitment age to, I think, 12, 13. It used to be 9, 10. Okay, that means that they are already recruiting very, very young people. So we need to tackle this, and particularly if we want to tackle prevention and we want to get them involved in prevention, then we need to start working at a very early age. On the idea of young and as not passive subjects, as mentioned by Moussa as well, and as UPF is proving by all the projects that it's implementing, which is not considering young people only as targets, as passive, susceptible of being radicalized subjects, but as agents of change. And in that say, people have a voice and a say in the process, not only on what they are expected to receive, what they are entitled, what is justice or unjust, but also the idea that how things should be envisaged, how policies should be constructed. And this is why we also had this focus on involving, engaging youngsters. On the idea of externalizing, Ricard, and this is the thing. I mean, I know what you are meaning. Yeah, obviously. Those who attacked, and in the case, the great majority, of the vast majority of perpetrators of terrorist attacks in Europe in the last years, they were Europeans. Many of them, or most of them, born and raised in Europe, pure 400% European citizens. The minimum of them came from migration or came out from migration. I mean, we have seen on the one hand, Western Balkans had been as a sort of paradise in the sense of radicalization, meaning they did not have great issues. But now we are seeing the interplay between national identities and national belonging, identity, and radicalization. This is every day much more clear. This will also, I mean, the Balkans has become a transit. In these last years, when Moussa mentioned all these foreign fighters fleeing to Syria and Iraq and coming back, the Balkans have been an area of transit, and it's in Europe, and this is something concerning. In the Middle East and North Africa, on the one hand, there are no data, there are not good research. It is absolutely state-controlled, the majority of cases, and there is little or very few done. So the idea is that you need also to work and to understand what's going on. The most interesting thing, I think, is that comparing the two regions, where there are different national settings, different identity, demographic settings, will provide some very valuable compared data that will allow us at least to see shared trends, commonalities, experiences, practices, and this might be applicable and useful also for its own European Union design strategy. And that was the first thinkings, the first reflections I wanted to make.
Thank you. Thank you, Lourdes. And Mar and Moussa, maybe you can react to Lourdes or to my one questions. Open reflections, I would say. Moussa, Mar?
I don't know if Mar wants to start. We can maintain the same order.
No. We are just chatting together. This is a conversation. This is a conversation. Moussa, is your turn.
I think Lourdes' responses were quite complete, actually, and just I wanted to react on your question about the profile of recruiters, because as you underlined, it's not the same as the ones who are being recruited. Actually, we talk about people who are often older, who know what they do. And in this respect, there was a study carried out by Mark Sageman, who is quite notorious in that field. He published a book called Understanding Terror Networks. And actually, the figures about recruiters are quite scary, because he studied the biography of over 150 leaders of terrorist organizations, including jihadist ones, and he showed that 88% among them had a university level. And in the case of jihadist organizations, 20% of the leaders of these organizations have a PhD. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who was the self-proclaimed caliphate, who proclaimed himself as leading the caliphate, himself, he had a PhD in Islamic studies. So we are not dealing with poor, marginalized, uneducated people when it comes to recruiters. And the same goes also for jihadists again. I wanted really to stress the point on relative deprivation, because if you look at the second generation of members of Al-Qaeda in the early 21st century, like those who perpetrated the 9/11, they were coming from really wealthy families. They had university degrees. They were coming from the middle upper class. So we should not be mistaken when we try to equate the lack of education with a higher propensity for joining violent extremist groups.
Good. Mar, some reactions or?
Yeah, I would say about the narrative issue that you pointed out.
I was also interested by you because you seem also to have a much more broader view of extremism and not only focused on religion. And then I would like maybe to extend more on that because it seems to me interesting also.
It's perfect because I was about to take the point about narratives. Exactly at that point, because in fact it's interesting to see how narratives also are connected among each other. And one example would be in the case of Europe, how the far right movement narratives is quite connected with the jihadist movement, jihadist narrative, let's say, because it's at the end they agree both that the coexistence between different religions, it cannot happen, that there is this so-called war of civilization, and the violence has to be the tool to be used. Regarding the externalization also, I would say that, yeah, as Lourdes said, and I mean, she already replied quite to all these questions. I would say that it's not only and this master proof, it's not only a matter of violent extremism, of migration. In general, states, and not only states, power, because also we work also a lot on the corporate role on violent human rights violations, and sometimes are not even states, are big corporations, transnationals that have more power than specific states. So at the end, their interest, it will never go in a natural way at the same direction of the interest of the most population. So it will be always for us key to work from a grassroots, from a civil society perspective, strengthening networks, alliances, and pushing and, let's say, forcing the EU or each ex-government to improve, to review their system of their anti-terrorist policies, or even their narrative towards specific aspect. And the last point I wanted to also to share about one point that Moussa said that I think it's really, really interesting. And in fact, we were thinking about it because it's what he said about why some youth radicalize and some other not, even if they have the same context. We work a lot in Palestine, and we in fact we were trying to see with our Palestinian partners to try to do this kind of research or analyze with the context of Gaza, because if you see the Gaza Strip in terms of socioeconomic situation, freedom of any kind, it would be like the perfect context to have thousands of radicalized people, let's say, and it's not the case. And at the end, it's not the case. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mar. Maybe we can jump to some questions because some students are shy. It is difficult. Myself, my experience in teaching is very difficult to promote participation through virtual means. But in any case, we have one from Mireia Ross that asks something that maybe has not been, she's right, because she has not, it is a topic that has not been addressed. It is about the channels used by extremist groups to spread the propaganda and so on. If these fall also within the prevention, and what are, if you have been focusing on that, what are the main outcomes of your first observation on that? And maybe a second question comes from Lourdes to Marc. I just try to transfer Lourdes also because she's right also, and I should jump also saying that it will be interesting, Marc, if you could explain the UPF has been received by local governments. And I think it's quite interesting also because prevention is one thing, if I understood perfectly Lourdes, but prevention is one thing. You can give some recommendation, but how the government process these recommendations is another route that maybe could be addressed. How you relate with non-democratic governments where the network is implanted. This is the final part of the question of Lourdes. Maybe we can go to Marc and then maybe to others regarding the Mireia Ross question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I saw the chat. And well, normally the UPF has been the first impression is bad always, and yeah, I mean, and it depends on the country. In fact, in Jordan, we have been working really slowly and with a low profile because it's still now impossible to work otherwise. On the other hand, it's interesting because as I think it was Lourdes also, you mentioned it before, I think that as in the southern, let's say, countries, it's like an issue that we have to work on because the EU, the US, and ex-donors say that to ex-governments that they have to work on that. In fact, it's easier, I think, for us to work. I mean, these days, my colleague, our director, Lucas Gervason, and my colleagues from Tunisia, they are working directly with the Terrorist Commission of the government of Tunisia to work on preparing seminars and debates and to work on this kind of plans. That if you think that this would be that easy to organize it in Spain or France, I'm not that sure. Mm-hmm. So I think this is the opportunity that we have as foreign, let's say that we can try to open a bit that door and to put and to strengthen the national people, the national organizations, and to be there and to mark, as you mentioned it before, and the youth itself to be there in these strategies. But it depends. In Iraq, for example, we work directly with one ministry, the Ministry of Education. Depending of its context, we use one strategy or another.
Mm-hmm. Good. And in reference to the Mireia Ross question related to the channels used by extremist groups to spread their proposal, have you some thought about that?
If you want, I can step in, and maybe Mar and Moussa can also add the reflection. I will not give you data, okay, because I have no data in hand, but normally research has been focused on the places, spaces, physical spaces, spaces where radicalization occurs, where recruitment takes place, okay, where these so-called extremist narratives run through. We have focused a lot in the field of mosques, saying, okay, it's the preaching that is radical. So there has been a huge effort. Particularly, I am referring to the European dimension, not so much, but also in certain countries of the Middle East, North Africa as well, and in the Balkans as well. the idea is let's solve the problem, let's control the speech on Friday in the mosque, and then everything is solved. I mean, then we have realized that mosques sometimes might be a misleading hint, because radicalization, I mean, once you know the system, you avoid radicalizing through this space. Prisons have always been, these last years, a very a central space of research. There has been proofs of people getting radicalized in prisons. Of the context, there is still a huge discussion going on what is best. Should we isolate terrorist convicted prisoners, or should we allow them to be in community, because that might favor rehabilitation, but that might also favor continuous propagation of extremist ideology. So these issues are still things that are not solved. And in the case of prisons, the idea of rehabilitation is very much a way, because de-radicalization programs are very few. There is, and as Moussa said at the beginning, and this is one of the key issues, there is no reliable data. On the experiences that have been taken place in Europe, several experiences, there's very few of evaluation of impact, of performance. So there's a lack of self-evaluation on the project. Everybody tends to say, oh, that was great, that worked excellent, because nobody wants to say my idea was not really so successful. So we have in all countries of Europe, for example, hotlines to call on our neighbors. Okay, my neighbor has grown a huge bird, he might have become a dangerous Salafi. Okay, I can call stop jihadismos and call on my neighbor, but we don't have reliable data on to what extent these sort of hotlines are useful, how many calls end up being something serious, etc. So that's a problem. We have also started to enter into schools, and this is for me one of the most dangerous places where we are trying, because always we have to take into account the idea of the premise of not harming. And sometimes when we enter into schools trying to do something as prevention of violent extremism, it might be even harming more than helping. Okay, and then the last probably star of physical spaces of radicalization is social media. Okay, it has been, I mean, a huge growth of attention in these last years, and this has reinforced the idea of narratives. First set counter narratives. So let's say they say you need to kill in the name of Islam, and you say a counter narrative is no, you don't need to kill in the name of Islam. So now what are people talking about? They are talking about alternative narratives, because that might give a little bit more sense to this idea of dialogues opposing, clashing continuously. And just to finish up, what Mar said about Gaza is very interesting. Okay, she said, why, if the situation in Gaza is so dramatic and it complies with all variables required for radicalization, why there are no violent extremism attacking infidels in Gaza? Because probably there is another cause that is channeling the energy of young people. I mean, when the energy of young people is channeled through some other issues, some other causes, in this case is fighting against occupation, that drives attention away from other sorts of engagement, which might be either more positive or either more negative. In this case, more negative in engaging in violent extremism.
Thank you, Lourdes. Moussa, you want to say something? I wanted also to raise the idea of education, because this is something. Okay, I just explain you an anecdote, but for me was important. When I was in Meknes in Morocco, and in the university, and before properly beginning my one lecture, in the same room there were a professor, a very senior professor, surrounded by many people, many younger students. And my host explained me, because they were speaking in Arabic, were explaining me that they are creating a network of university on young people to speak about terrorism. and to try to prevent terrorism through conversation of young people from university, and these people from university will go to school and to speak about that, about radicalization and so on. And then that made me many thoughts. First, that it was not a problem of Europe. It was also Morocco have some policies to prevent terrorism, because they feel that it is also a Morocco problem. And then I think this was very important. And the second thought was how strong they are working in a network of university to incorporate conversation within young students about terrorism, about radicalization, as one of the main global issues that affect Morocco and that affect the picture of Morocco towards Europe, because most of the first terrorists that we know were not only from Tunis but from Morocco, and how to prevent. Morocco have also some policy to prevent the picture of Morocco on the immigrants. I don't know if you are looking for that also, because I thought listening you, this anecdote comes to my mind. Lourdes and Moussa, Omar.
Maybe I mean your comment is very interesting about Morocco, and it is true that Morocco was one of the first countries, if not the first, in North Africa to start developing efforts in that direction. And actually, it is interesting because when you do a comparative analysis, when you look at the way each country is developing a policy, as said earlier, we do not have enough data in order to design a policy. So what happens in that case is that you see how policymakers end up developing policies on the basis of their own understanding of the problem, not of what the problem is, but how they do perceive the problem. So in the case of Morocco, most of the policies, they are based on the assumption that a radical is somebody who misunderstands the holy text, who misunderstands the Quran. So you have a prevalence of the religious drivers of radicalization, and you see many programs developed in jails, but also you have a program called Morshidat, where they trained women preachers in order to address female radicalization, and so on and so forth. So this has helped actually the country to promote its image internationally. And here I think it's very interesting, because I would react directly to the question made to Lourdes, actually to Marc. How do you work with countries that are authoritarian or even dictatorships? And I think that this whole rhetoric about violent extremism is interesting for regimes that are seen as authoritarian or even dictatorships, because by focusing on the individual, you end up adopting a sort of pathological, psychological interpretations of what happens, and you overlook some important parameters. One of them has to do with the foreign policy, and including, I mean, this works for Europe too. I'm not referring only to North Africa or the MENA region, but what kind of foreign policies do we have? Who are our allies? Our allies, are they necessarily allies against violent extremism or not? And this is, I think, a key question. We don't talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We do not talk about the dictatorship in Egypt, or how the lack of democracy pushes some individuals in the hands of terrorism. Actually, more than 90% of terrorist attacks perpetrated 2 years ago were perpetrated in non-democratic states, non-democratic societies. I think it's an interesting data. And in the end, while we do not deal with radicalization as a process that does have a political dimension, I think everybody's happy. All the states, from Spain to Morocco to Tunisia to France and so on. So I think it's important to underline that dimension, because sometimes by over-focusing on micro drivers of radicalization, we may forget the global picture. And the global picture in the last 2 decades is marked by a proliferation of conflicts that have been greatly exploited by violent extremist groups.
Yeah, I remember because I give the floor now to Lourdes because she requests intervention. But I remember your last words are perfectly current with what I remember from this anecdote, because I didn't understand anything because the professor was speaking in Arabic surrounded by the same student that will attend my lecture. But the only thing that I understood was globalization, because in Arabic, I guess it is the same. And then the purpose of the professor was also to say that it is not a terrorism, and this problem is a global problem that only could be addressed globally and not by one state or another state and so on. And then the idea of globalization was one of the key words of this course. It was a global issue, and not an others and us issue, as Europe is building the narrative. This is, I think, very important to take that into account. Nobody will say that climate change is an Arabic problem. It's a global issue, and then terrorism is a global issue in the same terms. And this is, I think, very important to place the problem in such a way. But this is just my reaction to Moussa also reaction also. Lourdes, maybe you want to say something, and then I will leave the floor after that to Marc Borras. I give the floor, and he will formulate the question also with us.
No, just to insist on this idea of the political grievances behind radicalization and violent extremism. In fact, Moussa reviewed very well different approaches to the issue of radicalization, these different attempts to explain the phenomenon. And one of the issues that has been widely neglected is how much political sometimes this process turns to be, okay? And not only in the terms, if we see it from the perspective of Europe and from the perspective of how, for example, European foreign policies impact on certain countries or certain regions of the world, and how certain double standards in dealing with humanitarian issues. And here, for example, Ricard, I think this is very, very interesting to see. I mean, we are dealing with very challenging situations. How, for example, the speech by President Macron on Islamist separatism, and how the huge
don't
package.
Speak about Macron. Macron is awful.
Yeah,
I always say that Macron is provoking. Is against. It's awful. Huh? Sorry.
I'm just trying to provoke Moussa a little bit. That's all. No, but the thing, and that's the idea, is how, I mean, people will feel threatened by this sort of offensive, not only on Islamism, or not only on violent terrorists, but on Islamism and on Muslims per se. But how do we match this with the images of people trying to cross the Mediterranean with these double standards by the European Union member states in dealing with humanitarian crisis, in even suggesting, for example, how in the midst of a pandemic, migration and vaccines might become exchangeable goods. This is horrible, and this is, as Francois Bourgas says, this is creating more terrorists. I mean, and this is one of the key issues. Then on the other side, we have authoritarian systems, and how authoritarian systems fit the circle of violence. Okay, the nexus between repression and radicalization has been widely demonstrated in the Middle East, North Africa in the past. We have seen with the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, we have seen with the history of other different movements, not only Islamist movements, but other protest movements. So the idea is also how there is an intentionally undermining of political grievances. Nobody will like, Mar said at the beginning, I mean, governments don't like you because you enter into a field, a domain that has been historically the property of the state, which is the field of security, and you enter with different ideas, and you enter saying, okay, you are also responsible. And in order to end with this provocative issue, now we are talking about prevention, we are talking a lot about resilience, about how resilient communities need to be, how we need to be resilient facing the pandemic. But sometimes resilience seems not to be understood as the capacity to adapt to new circumstances. It seems that the government says, okay, you have to endure this, so fuck you up, suffer this, hold on, because this is what it takes, and that's it. And this is not resilience. This takes the responsibility out of the government and the authorities and places it to the communities. And this is not fair. So we are trying also to reverse this idea.
No. Perfectly. Thank you, Lourdes. Maybe I give the floor to Mark. Mark, are you here? Because I give you the possibility. I discover that technically it's possible to give the floor to attendees. Mark? No? Okay.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect.
I think I unmute you myself, and then I have to unmute you also at the same time.
Okay.
Because there was some noise. Okay, go.
Okay. At the first of the seminary appears the idea that the necessity to define well extremism and radicalism and so on. And I'm sometimes we can see or we can hear the same discourse against radicalism. Actually, that, for example, in the 90s against ETA or against other terrorist bands. And I'm wondering if you think, your opinion about if it's possible to link these different extremisms or terrorism or radicalism decade to decade, or is something about only the narrative of the state, of the status quo. For example, when the attacks in 11M in 11M to Madrid, it was saying that this attack affect to the credibility or to the perception of people against ETA, and ETA was really damaged by this attack, and this the appearance of this kind of terrorism in the area, and I'm not sure about that, and I'm thinking, and I'm asking to you if this linking of the concept like terrorism or like radicalism or extremism, it's possible to link some characteristics about it.
Thank you, Mark. Someone wants to react, Mark, Moussa, or Lourdes, to that? Maybe Mark introduced the historical dimension, because I think all societies have been educated, I would say, or socialized also on the other terrorists. Like I'm thinking about Italy, I am thinking about Spain and other countries, other European countries, and then what makes the link, what are the differences, and so on. If I understand correctly, maybe Mark is formulating this kind of questions, linking ourselves into our past terrorists, not directly related to religion.
I may start just with a sort of theoretical comment. I don't know if Lourdes and Mar agree, because I think Mark's question is very interesting.
Yeah.
We used to talk about terrorism, and this roundtable is about violent extremism. I'm not sure that we were looking at the process of radicalization through which Basque people, members of ETA, were going through 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago. And actually, when you look at the origins of this change of vocabulary, but also of approach, it can be traced back to 2005, when the Bush administration decides to revise its global strategy, its global war against terror, they just figure out that they have waged war against terrorism, which means something impossible to localize. And despite of that, they see that not only they have not eradicated Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda has expanded and has proliferated to other conflict zones. And there, this is the moment where violent extremism starts being more popular and more used by the administration and later on by researchers, because the Bush administration suspects that if Al-Qaeda is expanding, it's the problem has not to do with terrorism, but they suspect that there is some massive sympathy from the Muslims towards this terrorist organization. So this is where the rhetoric of violent extremism and radicalization, which is the process through which somebody adopts an ideology and in fine a violent behavior, comes from. So I think it's interesting because if you try to define terrorism, you cannot find any definition according to international law because it's a political definition. It's not a legal one. One man's terrorist can be another man's freedom fighter. Think of those who went to Syria and Iraq. They would never consider themselves as terrorists, but as people who are going to free Syrian people from Bashar al-Assad, for instance. And I think it's important to underline that dimension because from this moment until today, with the rhetoric of violent extremism, we somehow end up, as said just earlier, we overlook a little bit the political dimension. So we focus on what makes people become radicals, but we don't ask about the why. I mean, what is the machine that produces that? And I think a great challenge for all of us working in the field of research, but also for policymakers, is to try to look also at what produces terrorism. And I think, I mean, this is why it's a very tricky and sensitive question, because it implies looking at what, I mean, at somehow what responsibility you may have or not in feeding this process.
Thank you, Moussa. Some other reaction from Mark Lurdes to the Mark Borràs question.
Okay, yeah. Because also I also think that it's a really interesting question, and in fact, during the process of creating the UPF, the observatory, and on agreeing on definitions, I will put here in the chat our definition of the UPF about violent extremism, because yeah, it was really difficult to agree to have a common as Moussa said, there are a lot of definitions and everything is political. And I was thinking maybe the best way to explain it would be with the example of Palestine, where we as NOVACT, we worked in Palestine since a long time ago on non-violence. And now we are trying to see if it would be interesting or if the Palestinian people and civil society want to work on violent extremism. But even with non-violence, it was already a sensitive issue because as they are occupied, they are military occupied, by international law, they have the right, let's say, legally, to use violence, okay? I mean, so it's different. I mean, we had always, when we were talking about non-violence, they would say, no, resistance, then you will choose which you want, but they defend also their right to resist violently and to differentiate it to terrorism, that obviously Israel uses this narrative about terrorists, but it's really complicated. And in fact, we, again, as NOVACT, as we work on these sensitive issues, we are often attacked by different non-government, I would say maybe lobbies. And the last one was they often accuse us to support terrorist Palestinian people, even if we work on non-violence and we insist on the non-violent alternative. And lately, and linked with the PV, the last accusation we received was why you say you are working on PV violent extremism, but in your reports you don't talk about the independent Catalanist terrorism or violent extremism groups, no? And it's like, well, because nowadays there is not, the violence is not the main. So it's not to answer the question, maybe just to open it more, because it's really a complex question.
Thank you, Ma, for your intervention. I don't know if Lourdes wants to say something. We will have to leave at least in 10 minutes. We have still almost 10 minutes for that. I have myself some questions, but I prefer to leave the floor to Lourdes. Or just to my reaction. I think even Mar also is using the term maybe differently from the others, and using the term in terms of ideology. And I think that's very important to speak about radical ideology, and then an ideology that is against pluralism, against all liberal or democratic values, and then try to impose other values, and then from this point of view, it is better framed than to link radicalism to religion. And then this narrative is important, because it is not the same to speak about radical ideology than radical and extremism related to religion and to Islam or whatever. I think this is very important. But a question comes to me, and then maybe provoked by Lourdes, because I have my own thought about how Macron is reacting towards the professor that has been killed, which is the first time that and it was not in the public arena than the other terrorist attack. It has been the first time that it is a sector oriented, and the sector that has been oriented is education, which is the most important sector for secularism in France. And then that makes some understanding about the radical, I will say also, reaction to Macron and the government, because they are touching one of the main, the central column of the French of the Frenchness in one way, education. But the way that Macron is building this narrative, making an effort to do that is not. They are saying this kind of narrative. Okay, it is not Christianism against Islam. This is not the narrative. He say it is civilization against barbarism. And then I wonder if this change, this shift of narrative is right or not. My intuition is that it is not right, because that belongs to the same. Not to put in the problem or to problematize the issue in terms of clash of religions, of civilization, but it is Macron says a matter of civilization against barbarism. What do you think about that? It is the right solution, a right shift or not?
I think I will need to let Moussa speak before me. Wait. Sorry, I think. Oh, okay. I think I will need to let Moussa speak before me, because I think he has much stronger opinion than me. But I think that we need first, and before, we will just say that we need to see very carefully the chain of events, okay, and see how one thing fits the other. Okay, first thing, we have in the commemoration of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the speech by Macron at the beginning of October. Then we have the murdering of the school teacher. Then we have much more harder measures with this these cartoons screened in public buildings. Then we have Erdogan responding, and we have two great testosterone, full of testosterone leaders fighting and insulting each other and saying who is more sick from the two, and calling a boycott and calling to stigmatize Muslim activism in France in a large scale. So I think that if we need to take the scale of the chain of events to see how one thing fits the other.
Maybe Moussa can react also, because Lourdes also requested Moussa reaction.
Well, forgive me, I don't know whether I will respond as a French citizen or as a researcher, but in any case, if I'm not being objective, you just stop me, please, Ricard, because I will get passionate about this. Basically, Macron's current reaction, I think, it echoes a debate that has been ongoing in France since 2015, when the new wave of terrorist attacks started. We have seen this debate between Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy. The debate was, why is France the target of terrorist attacks? Why France has the highest number of people who went to Syria and Iraq? So to Gilles Kepel, the explanation was quite simple. He was explaining the fact that the Muslim communities in France are becoming radical, more and more radical. They adopt the Salafist way of practicing Islam. And as a result of that, we see more and more jihadists. Like some Salafists are moving towards jihadism, and they end up blowing themselves up. And Olivier Roy was saying, no, Islam is not a problem. Islam is not the cause, it's the pretext of that. Those young people, they want to get access to violence, and they are today jihadists as they would have been Marxist-Leninists in the 70s. So the problem is violence. It's this youth revolt, not. And actually, what we see during these 5 years, despite of the fact that we have this debate, we don't have data about this, and we know now that French jihadists, they have very little level of religious knowledge. Despite of that, the prevention efforts from France have gone into a direction where they were already going before the terrorist attacks, meaning that we need to have a control over Islam, and we need to oppose tremendously our laïcité, our secularism, in order to stop Islamism. So we end up in a sort of confusion, and this is where the project, the law that is being discussed now, the law called on separatism, comes from. The idea is to deal with Islam, to control it as a state, which is secular, and this is a fundamental contradiction, because laicity is separation between the state and religion. It's not about managing Muslims through the Ministry of Interior, as we do. And actually, I think sadly that Macron, who during his campaign 3 years ago was criticizing Hollande for having such a conservative stance, he is actually using exactly the same narrative. France has said 5 years ago, we are at war against jihadism. And Macron repeated that 2 months ago, and he said, either you are with us or you are against. And what is happening since then is completely unrealistic. I mean, they have dissolved just yesterday the NGO defending Muslims' rights, because I mean there is a terrorist attack against a professor, and you end up suspending or dissolving an NGO defending human rights recognized by the United Nations. And there is a climate today where the efforts are done in a way that the more we control Muslims, the more we oppose secularism to Islamism, separatism, Salafism, anyway. Try to find it clear in the middle of the confusion, the safer we will be. And this is not working, actually.
Thank you, Moussa, for this emotional intervention, I would say. But very, very clever, I would say, doing this overview of the French reaction and this effort to change and to make a shift of the narrative and highlighting at the end, maybe this is one of the main main arguments in this debate is the importance of narrative on how we speak about that, and how far the narrative could be also a driver and then this kind of reflexivity is very important, I guess, and I hope that also for Lourdes, she will take that into account in the one research in identifying this plurality of this interface of drivers. Some other reaction from Mark maybe, and then we leave just the last minute for each to say something else. Mark, do you want to react to that or no?
No, not that much. I agree.
Okay. Maybe we can close because we have to leave 5 minutes before, because I know that the students have now another course in the master, and we have even to change some schedule of the other course because of overlapping. But we can leave the floor maybe. I would like to take from Lourdes some possibilities to follow up your research in one way or another. I know we are each other in contact, and then we will have a possibility to chat and to follow that. But it will be very interesting to know how can people that are listening could follow you and your research. Maybe some publication or some outcome, or maybe some event that will take place, and then how can we follow you in one way or another, and maybe what you expect also to do about that. Lourdes?
Just to say that we have a web page, we have a newsletter, we have social media accounts, so you can follow our news, our publications. We just published in summer first conceptual paper. Now we are going to release counter reports that will be very useful to see the state of the art of the issue in the MENA and Balkans. We will issue also the regional and cross-regional reports. We had last Friday our first Connect seminar involving some stakeholders and some researchers and other projects. And we will be informing you and trying to get you involved as much as possible in the research. But anyway, I invite you to keep track of our progress and also other projects' progresses through our website and social media accounts.
Thank you, Lourdes. Moussa or Mark, some last.
No, again, thank you very much for the invitation, and yes, we keep working and trying to improve a bit the world.
Okay, thank you, Mark. In any case, we have also your data, and people that are listening maybe could also go and jump to the website of your interesting group working on this kind of issues in a broad sense, if I understood correctly, about prevention and conflicts. Moussa, it's your turn.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to thank you for offering this space to discuss, and it's a pleasure to see that many people and institutions are working on this issue. So thank you for hosting us, and thank you, Lourdes, for the invitation. That was great.
Okay, thank you, Moussa, and thank you also to the 27 attendees of this debate. We will try also to see how we can edit that, because it has been recorded. But in any case, just to offer this debate also to other people that for one reason to another were not able to attend. In any case, thanks to Lourdes, Mar, and Moussa for that. To Carmen for allowing also technically to be there, because she organized everything, and to know what's happened technically with this kind of cam prevention in any case. But I think the main message has been done. Even with CAM, we discover that we don't need CAM, or maybe because there is not CAM, but we are in later stage and socialized in virtual meetings, and then the CAM is not strictly necessary to follow a debate. Maybe this happened at the beginning, we will be much more lost, but now we are socialized with that, and I think it was easy, at least for me, to follow properly. But a shame also not to be able to see people at least scream to scream. But in any case, thanks to Lourdes, Moussa, and Marc, and we can follow also the other seminar series in GRITIM and social media, and nothing more. Just good luck for the research, and hopefully the research will offer us some light and open some doors that we are in so much need on that. Thank you for